Thank you very much, Chairman Foster, and thank you to our witnesses for being here at this very important hearing, and what will prove, I'm sure, to be a fascinating hearing on combating the spread of misinformation on social media. We live in an amazing world, a world where we are presented with a selected, curated news feed that only includes the things that we're personally interested in. And that's informed by algorithms that companies like social media have come up with to foster user engagement and to maximize our interest in the information that's being provided. But unfortunately, as the chairman pointed out, that's also catalyzed the spread of misinformation. Combating that spread is something that has been a societal problem for hundreds of years now, but it's exacerbated by the fact that information now spreads so easily, and that information is personalized to each one of us. So the information that I see in the morning is not the same thing that the information that other people see in the morning. And unfortunately, that can hide and mask the spread of this misinformation. And if you want a perfect example of how that can be problematic, you can look at a hearing that this subcommittee held a couple of weeks ago on the origins of COVID. And one of the, for me, the very surprising outcomes of that committee hearing was the fact that although we had competing theories about the spread of COVID, that any theory other than natural zoonotic origin had been rejected early in the crisis as misinformation and had been labeled a conspiracy theory, and that the social media companies had actively suppressed the spread of that information. And now, with the benefit of hindsight and the discovery of new data, we've discovered that competing theories are not only possible, but indeed plausible, and in fact, might end up being the successful theory. So no one can deny that this effort to combat the spread of misinformation has severely hampered our ability to identify the origins of COVID. And it just illustrates how these two ideas are in tension, right? On one hand, we want to be a society that honors the exercise of free speech, but that is fundamentally in tension with the idea that we also have an obligation to stop the spread of misinformation. So I'm hopeful that some of our panelists today will be able to talk some more about kind of that, where that moral boundary is, and figuring out as a society how to balance those two competing interests, I think is critical. Because on the one hand, as recent events have shown, we all have a vested interest in trying to figure out how to stop the spread of misinformation. But on the other hand, history has shown us repeatedly that if we allow censorship to take the place of misinformation, that will take us down a very dark path as a society. So we have to find this middle ground, this balance in between the two. And I'm confident that we can. And I'm also confident that the social media companies like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter are going to be critical to helping us solve this problem, because they have the expert knowledge in the way their algorithms work. They have the expert knowledge in the way that this information spreads and what catalyzes people's interest in news about the world around them. And so I think definitely that they're going to need a seat at the table. We're going to need to tap all of our available sources of information, which certainly includes them, but also includes the independent researchers we're going to hear from today. And I'm very thankful that they're out there gathering this information to give us a holistic view of this problem. So I am looking very much forward to the hearing and looking forward to asking questions afterwards. Let me start with Ms. Edelson. You had something in your written testimony that you didn't have time to bring up in your oral testimony, in which you made some recommendations about things that can be done to facilitate access to information. And one of the things that you proposed was to create a legal safe harbor for researchers in working with this data. And I wanted to give you a platform to elaborate a little bit on that. But if you could also, as you talk about that, if you could talk about whether or not that legal safe harbor should also apply to the platforms themselves, since ostensibly they would be giving you that data that could create liability for them as well.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think it's a very good one. So the researcher safe harbor proposal that the Knight First Amendment group and I have called for would provide legal protections to researchers like me who engage in direct study of platforms by using it. I think that's the general thrust. There are many excellent researchers who do really important ethnographic work. I'm thinking particularly of Joan Donovan out of Harvard, who does really good work studying militia groups, how they recruit, other extremist groups like this. And this would provide cover to these researchers for their work, so that, again, within bounds, that they handle data responsibly, that their work is overseen by institutional review boards, that is within ethical boundaries. As to whether platforms themselves would need legal cover, I think in general, I would need to go back and talk to the lawyers about that. To my knowledge, in general, we're covering data that is generally accessible. So I actually don't know if that would be required.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so yeah, you brought up the institutional review boards, which is something else I have a question about. Just because when I got my doctorate, my research was qualitative and only involved interviews, and yet my RRB gave me a hard time about that data. I can't imagine what yours did to you. I have a question for Dr. Mislove. In your oral testimony, you discussed the fact that running experiments on the platform is beyond the capabilities of a lot of researchers. And yet that seems to be the only way that we can get really unbiased data, because even if we ask the platform owners for data, we have a concern that the data that we're going to get back is biased in some way, just the same way if you ask a cigarette manufacturer whether or not tobacco use was safe, you wouldn't necessarily trust the veracity of that data. I have a further concern about this, though, and as a computer scientist myself, a lot of these algorithms are interconnected. You can't create a fake user and run some tests about what liking this does or what not liking that does, and to see how the algorithm works without affecting real users' pages, right? Because all of that data feeds back into it. So we kind of got this quantum mechanical situation where the act of observing the system is influencing the behavior of the system. As a researcher, how do you combat that?
Those are fantastic questions. Thank you for them. So to address your the first question about sort of the ability to study these, we are able to do it, but the limitation is when we become an advertiser, we're only really able to say what happens to our own ads, right? So it's much harder for us to go beyond that and say, okay, this is the kinds of effects we're seeing on other advertisers' ads. So we really can speak to the algorithm a bit, but we can't speak to sort of its impacts on users in many cases. To your second question around sort of the feedback loops and these sorts of quantum mechanical effects as you describe them, that's exactly right. And we think very much about that. To give you one example, one of the things we worried about is how much, like teasing out how much of the effects we see are due to users who engage with the content versus the algorithms that actually choose who to deliver it to. And Kevin had alluded to that in his testimony. We have come up with a number of cute tricks to be able to sort of tease those out in many cases, where we can sort of make sure that ads show up as the same to individual users, so we know the users can't react any differently, but the algorithm will see them differently. So there are ways in certain cases we can get around that, but it's something we take into account every time.
Oh, very interesting. Well, Mr. Chair, it looks like the clock is malfunctioning, which I guess is a good thing for me. But I'm just going to ask one final question and open it up to the whole panel to answer. The end goal here is, of the research you're doing, I think, is not only to understand how misinformation spreads, but to enable us to reach some kind of societal solution to halting the spread of misinformation without suppressing free speech. And I think we can get there, right? We've done that in other venues. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That's now recognized as something that's not an infringement on people's free speech because of its potential to cause harm. And I think we're going to reach some kind of standard with that as pertains to online misinformation. And I think just like we did there, it's going to revolve around the intent of the poster of that misinformation. But I'm wondering if you could weigh in, and anyone would like to, about what you think that ultimate solution is going to look like.
Can I take a stab at that one? one of the things my group thinks about in that regard, about how to balance the relationship between controlling misinformation and censorship, is to think about simply coming up with more effective labels. So people can post and basically spread anything that they want. So the communication itself is not censored. But one of the things that stops misinformation from spreading is often the cognitive interference of actually labeling this and say, are you sure you want to spread this or not? But I actually think even something like that is going to have to be fairly conservative. So there will be some types of misinformation that are simply not in the public interest to control or necessarily stop the spread of, and others that's more vital for, say, the public health or the public safety. So that would sort of be my group's way of dealing with this conundrum.
Ms. Edelson, go ahead.
So one of my very recent studies, one of our key findings was that misinformation outperformed factual content on Facebook. But the real meat of this was true for every partisan category. So far right misinformation outperforms far right factual content. Far left misinformation outperforms far left factual content. So I think we all want to get to a place where misinformation isn't prioritized. It is not in the fast lane against factual content. And we can do this without discriminating based on viewpoint or suppressing certain opinions, or certainly suppressing facts, as you've spoken to. I think what we need to get to is a place where engagement, user interactions is not the driving force of what content is promoted.
Right. Thank you very much. It's been really interesting. I'll look forward to the rest of the questions. Despite what's on the clock, I'm sure I'm out of time. So, Mr. Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you. And I guess if there's member interest, we can certainly entertain a second round of questions here, because this is, I can't imagine a more important subject actually right now.
So, for the second round, I'd like to take us like up to 30,000 feet. We've been talking about, the specific subject matter of this hearing is how do we eliminate the barriers to data to allow researchers to conduct research into the way that misinformation spreads on social media, right? But the big goal here is to try and figure out how to stop the spread of misinformation, which a lot of people have raised different examples of how it's been destructive over the last couple of years. So, and I have to say, I'm not optimistic about this. I'm a pessimist. Ms. Edelson, you were talking about the fact that maybe Facebook has not deliberately chosen to provide misinformation. And I know Congressman Perlmutter was skeptical about that. I'm skeptical too. And I don't think it's ever going to be reasonable to think that the data that you're getting voluntarily out of these platforms is going to be unbiased. I mean, there's too big a commercial incentive there. So I'd like to talk about the business model. Let me also say that, there's been testimony that perhaps some kind of framework around users owning their own personal data would solve this problem. And I have to tell you emphatically, I don't think it will. When I was in the California legislature, I was deeply involved in the drafting of the California Consumer Privacy Act. So I know a lot about it, but the problem here is not data and its connection to users. The problem is that these companies have a business model that's based around user engagement. And they can't even articulate to you, probably in some senses, how that works, because if it's a machine learning kind of thing, that has the goal of maximizing user engagement, you might not even know that it's promoting misinformation, because we don't get that kind of information back out of these algorithms. So I'm very skeptical that this is going to allow us to solve the problem. And I'm wondering your thoughts on this question. Should we be focusing more on the model? This model where Facebook and Twitter provide you this service for free. And if you don't know how it's being monetized, if you don't know what the product is, then the product is you, right? That's what economists say. And that's what it is. They're selling this user engagement. And the reason why you can't pay a monthly subscription fee to Facebook to avoid their advertising is that people would be horrified if they knew what it would cost you, how much money they're making off of each user. So here's a question to you. How do we avoid that? I mean, do we outlaw business models like this? Do we need more transparency? What's the ethical way of dealing with this issue?
That's a great question. And I think the meat of what you're asking is, how much is this a systemic issue? And I think the answer is, you're right. There is probably an inherent systemic problem with platforms that whose business model is built around maximizing user engagement. I think, I hear the tobacco company analogy a lot. I think I personally prefer maybe a pharmaceutical company analogy, because there are good things that come out of social media too, but there are certainly a lot of problems that can happen. Social media addiction is a very real thing. I think that we may be going toward a world where, we can acknowledge that there are good things about social media, and there are risks and there are harms, and some of these risks and harms are particularly acute for the youngest users. And I think in a framework like that, we probably need some regulation for this industry, in the same way that we have regulation for pharmaceutical companies, we have regulation for banks. I think in Chairman Foster's testimony, he spoke about this analogy as well. I think it's an apt one, where I think this is something that's important for society, but we all need much better auditing and transparency of how these platforms function.
Thank you. Any other thoughts about whether or not we need to focus more around maximizing user engagement as a business model? Dr. White?
I wanted to say another way of attacking the business model, or of making the business model a little bit more benign, might be to allow more competition for social media in the first place. So social media is dominated by a very small number of companies that sort of dominate the entire landscape. And if there were more competition over users themselves and users' attention, then the abuse of the users could probably be reduced somewhat, or I would think it would be at least be possible that would happen. So that might be one direction to go as well, if the business model itself can't be directly attacked.
Sure, I've thought about that too. That maybe similar to email. When I send you an email, you and I don't both have to be on Gmail for you to read what I'm saying, and so maybe we need to think about social media a different way. When I post something, maybe it goes out to everybody and it's out there in the metaverse. And if you choose to look at it on Facebook, that's your choice. But I don't know that that solves the bigger problem. But I mean, I really think that we as a society need to look at this and also realize, and this is the reason I'm pessimistic, realize that because there is such a strong commercial incentive, that no matter what we do, it's going to be an uphill battle. I mean, it's like counterfeit tax stamps on cigarettes, right? The commercial incentive for doing that is so strong that no matter how much resource you devote to enforcement, you're still going to have the problem. And I think that's the ethical situation we find ourselves in with social media. Anyway, my time's expired. I'd love to continue the conversation, but thanks everyone for being here, and thanks for the fascinating discussion. Dr. Licht, if I could ask you about something that was in your written testimony that I found very interesting. You were talking about how research indicates that one of the primary catalysts for the spread of misinformation is our inability as humans to process an abundance of information. And so I wonder if you could elaborate on that for a minute, and then maybe throw out some possible solutions to that problem.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, that's a problem of the end user. So there's some research that suggests that a lot of misinformation is spread not necessarily because a person is intending to spread misinformation, but because they're bombarded with so much information, they're not spending time to cognitively process what they see, so they just forward on posts that look interesting or attractive. And that's, that I think is a problem that psychologists have been talking about for years, not only with social media, but in other areas where we're just overloaded with information all the time. And so our ability to process it isn't very good. One of the solutions to that seems to be to sort of interrupt the automatic process that seems to go on when we read social media sites. So one of the promises of labeling is that if you're reading a set of social media posts, and then you come upon something that's labeled, that actually jars you out of this tendency to want to immediately share something. It gets you to think about whether you want to share it or not. And so it actually slows the process down. And that's a way then to get people to think about a specific thing they're reading, and not necessarily this specific thing is one of 200 things I'm reading and they're all the same. So this is going to be a pervasive problem that is going to be very hard to deal with. But some forms of labeling may help interrupt the process so that just automatic sharing using essentially our brain stems is stopped.
Interesting. So, I mean, what you're talking about is kind of a supply side solution to the problem, where social media companies would be interjecting this in a in a deliberate effort to combat the spread of misinformation. But I'm wondering if there might be a demand side solution. And Dr. Mislov, maybe I'll ask you about this. Is part of the solution perhaps increasing our technological literacy? So, in other words, when, we know that alcohol addiction is a problem in society, right? So we solve that problem, to the extent that we have solved it. We solve it with education, right? If you know you've got alcoholism that runs in your family because there's a genetic component, if you know that alcoholism can occur, perhaps that you're a little bit more careful about monitoring how many drinks you take, right? And so I'm wondering if isn't an educational component, like we make people aware of this phenomenon of how misinformation spreads. We make people aware that you've got confirmation bias, and so that makes you, when you read a piece of misinformation that fits right into your worldview, you're more likely to believe it. And in that way, maybe we encourage people to verify the veracity of something before they share it. I mean, is there anything to that, or or does it have to be a supply side solution?
I think it's a great question. I'll admit it's not my area, so I am truly, and I'll defer to some of my the other panelists to perhaps provide a more detailed answer. But I would think so, and I think I'll point you to. I know Twitter has recently done a number of things where if you go to retweet something but you haven't clicked the link, it will ask you, "Are you sure you want to do that? Maybe you should read the article first." And so it seems like those are inching.
Maybe you should go to Snopes as well.
Maybe you should go to Snopes as well. So I think those are inching in the direction of what you're talking about. But some of the other witnesses may have a more detailed answer.
Sure. Anyone else?
The only thing I'll say is that I suspect some kind of demand side solution, as you refer to it, is going to be necessary, but we don't know what that will look like. It could come in a wide range of forms, and this is actually one of the reasons we need data, because we really do need to start working on solutions, and we need an answer to that question.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. It's been a really fascinating hearing. And thank you, Mr. Foster, for catalyzing this whole discussion. I've really enjoyed it. I yield back.